criticised the US for endangering civilian lives in Syria and Iraq by using white phosphorus. The rights group has issued a report on the alleged use of the weapon that could expose civilians to dire risk. Here's the video that accompanies that report. It is said to show the use of the munition in Raqqa, although the group does say it hasn't been able to independently verify these pictures. We can get the thoughts now of Mary Wareham. She's the Advocacy Director of the Arms Division at Human Rights Watch. Good evening to you, Mary. Thanks for coming on tonight. What are your thoughts on this? Is it possible to use white phosphorus in densely populated areas such as Raqqa without endangering civilians?
The US-led coalition in Iraq and Syria says that it is using white phosphorus lawfully. We understand as a smokescreen or an obscurant to cover what activities that are happening on the ground. It's also not new. White phosphorus has been used in both Syria and Iraq on previous occasions, but on this time we decided it was time to put out a statement of our own warning against the using white phosphorus to attack personnel, people on the ground, or material objects. This is a multi-purpose munition, therefore its use is not prohibited in populated areas, but we see enough risk in the use and we see horror stories from past use and previous conflicts that we want the United States to be extremely careful and sparing when it uses white phosphorus, if it uses it at all.
So just to clarify, Mary, in your opinion, the use of white phosphorus here could endanger civilian lives?
That's why we issued the statement. Yes, there are hundreds of thousands of civilians still on the ground in Mosul and in Raqqa. It's a very complex situation, and there must be their reasons for using white phosphorus. We just see it as a weapon that should be used sparingly, if at all. Our other problem is that there are not clear rules in terms of using white phosphorus as a weapon. It is not covered by international law. It's not primarily designed as an incendiary weapon, but its incidental effects can cause terrible injuries, burns, smoke inhalation. This is a ground-launched weapon by artillery. It's not being dropped from the air, but once it opens and detonates in the air, it bursts open in the air, and then it drops down to the ground, and that's where you see these distinctive white smoke and fire as it comes down. Now, the white phosphorus will continue to burn once it hits the ground. So our question is, what is it hitting on the ground, and are adequate provisions being taken to ensure that civilians are not falling victim to white phosphorus?
Mary, if it is proved that white phosphorus was responsible for the deaths or severe injury of civilians, what sort of repercussions could there be for those responsible? What would you like to see?
Well, I mean, incendiary weapons have been used in Syria by Syrian government forces for the past 5 years with impunity, and more recently, since the Russian government began its joint operation in 2015 with Syrian government forces, there has been much civilian harm on the ground, but little in terms of accountability for the use of incendiary weapons in Syria. And now we see the use of white phosphorus in Iraq and Syria. It's yet another concern for us when it comes to the protection of civilians on the ground. We were not able to document any victims of white phosphorus from the recent use in Mosul or in Iraq, but I will note that we've not seen any further use of the white phosphorus in recent days since we issued our report.
More generally speaking, Mary, what can be done, do you think, to lessen civilian casualties in the war we're seeing in Syria and Iraq at the moment?
Well, I mean, across both Syria and Iraq, we see immense civilian suffering on the ground. We see a refugee crisis, a humanitarian crisis. Also, we're particularly concerned by the use of improvised explosive devices, anti-personnel landmines, explosive remnants of war. There's going to be a massive post-conflict recovery effort needed, but while the conflict rages, it's difficult to meet the needs of the people who are on the ground. We need the conflict to end so that we can start helping to clean up the mess that has been created.
Watchdogs are seriously concerned over what they say are mounting civilian deaths from US-led airstrikes against Islamic State, and the reported numbers are much higher than those being admitted by Washington. The UN says hundreds of civilians have reportedly been killed in recent airstrikes in the embattled Syrian city of Raqqa. The ISIL-held hub is under siege by US-backed local forces with the support of Western warplanes. Across the border in Iraq, civilian deaths are also reportedly rising in the Islamic State stronghold of Mosul, which has been under a similar siege for months now. The US-led coalition's also being accused of using incendiary weapons near civilians in both cities in what could potentially amount to war crimes. Caleb Maupin reports.
The U.S. coalition is more than willing to update the world on its activities against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
We have successfully been able to take ground from ISIS already in Raqqa.
I recently walked the streets of East and West Mosul, and I saw for myself that markets and their businesses are reopening. Civilians are moving around the city and living their lives.
However, UN investigators paint a very different picture of Raqqa.
Intensification of airstrikes, which have paved the ground for an SDF advance in Raqqa, has resulted not only staggering loss of civilian life, but has also led to 160,000 civilians fleeing their homes and becoming internally displaced.
The United States insists that less than 500 civilians have been killed throughout the entire campaign over the last 3 years in Iraq and Syria. However, the United Nations points out that 300 civilians have been killed in the last 4 months in Raqqa alone, and the situation in Mosul is even worse. This is just one example.
One of these airstrikes in the Zanjili area, that somewhere between 50 and 80 civilians may have been killed.
Airplanes hit our street and we went to rescue people under the rubble. We rescued those we could save and then left the area.
On top of that, the U.S.-led coalition is being accused of using white phosphorus. U.S. leaders won't confirm whether or not they're using the lethal chemical munition. However, they say that if they are, they're doing it in a manner that's consistent with international law. But Human Rights Watch points out that this chemical puts civilians in great danger, burning their flesh down to the bone. Even a minor burn from this toxic powder can be fatal.
White phosphorus has been used in both Syria and Iraq on previous occasions, but its incidental effects can cause terrible injuries. So our question is, what is it hitting on the ground, and are adequate provisions being taken to ensure that civilians are not falling victim to white phosphorus?
That's the nature of urban warfare, fighting in close confines with civilians and legitimate targets closely mixed in with each other. And there's only one way forward for the U.S. coalition.
We have already shifted from attrition tactics where we shove them from one position to another in Iraq and Syria to annihilation tactics. Civilian casualties are a fact of life in this sort of situation.
It looks like the United States has made their choice about how they're going to go about defeating ISIL. The only question left is how many more people are going to die for that to happen. Caleb Maupin, RT, New York.